So I'm sure absolutely anyone who has anything to do with games, media or gaming in general probably didn't fail to notice that Crash Bandicoot, the original trilogy, has been remastered, brought up to date and re-released on the PS4, nicely made and creatively developed, this time by Vicarious Visions, taking over for Naughty Dog, who of course made the original 3-game trilogy. But Crash Bandicoot as a whole is something that in many ways still has echoes of that old school adventure gaming platform that, while inspired by Sonic the Hedgehog in so many ways, attempted to make a 3D evolution, and for the most part is seen as being one of those core key games franchises that really did that and defined the early PlayStation era, with Crash himself becoming one of the early PlayStation mascots before his eventual multi-platform debut with the 4th major game in the series going forward, Wrath of Cortex. But it's curious how Crash in today's standards holds up as an actual game itself. Obviously the values of yesteryear aren't really what we see as today, and what seemed like a fair game back then is something that by today's standards is actually a hell of a lot harder than you might remember. Either that or they've just not done something quite right with the porting process, and while they've done everything possible to make the games look and feel like they used to, there's certain things they've done, certain concessions that make the games very much different than what they used to be. And playing through both Crash 1 and Crash 1 NSane Trilogy version has led me to believe that there's very many differences between these games that some people have explored, and there's no doubt loads of videos on YouTube at the moment that have really delved into the art changes and the did you know they changed this and that part of it. But there's various other smaller bits that really make up that original Crash 1 experience that have been changed, and some for the better, I think it's worth to point out, but some things as well that have made it a fundamentally different experience. And playing Crash 1 back to back, literally playing the first level of one and the first level of the other, and so on and so forth, all the way up, and trying to get the gems where possible as well, because Crash 1, the original version, is just that hard when it comes to doing that. There's a lot of things that I don't really think people have covered, and so today, as opposed to my original plan of Sonic the Deep, I'm taking you through Crash Bandicoot, both the original Crash Bandicoot and the NSane Trilogy version of Crash Bandicoot, with more comparison between the two. But hopefully you'll learn a few things as well about Crash, if you've not already learnt plenty much through, as I say, the oversaturation of videos on the Crash NSane Trilogy. And so with that, let's dive into Crash Bandicoot, the first original one in all its crazy 90s polygon glory. I think everyone knows at this point Crash 1 obviously started out as a game called Sonic's Arse, because the idea was obviously to make a version of Sonic the Hedgehog that followed with the camera behind the character, as opposed to the standard 2D routes that Sonic the Hedgehog has as a character. Now, I don't see many people pointing out that's not the only game design they kind of take from that, although it's mostly obvious for the most part, and especially the influences from the very first Sonic game as well, and how that's influenced the very first Crash Bandicoot game. Aside from obviously the fact that Crash does have very heavy placed platform 2D sections that are increasingly difficult and very much unforgiving most of the time, something that the original Sonic the Hedgehog has, although I'm not entirely sure that that was actually by design and just perhaps something that they happen to share in common as to first in the series a very popular platform games with popular characters, but nevertheless one that the first instance of that franchise didn't very much have everything set in stone for what they wanted to do when it came to the gameplay and how everything would look. While even Crash Bandicoot for its time was an amazing feat of actual artistry, and the same with Sonic the Hedgehog on the Genesis was actually to say the same extent. Sonic the Hedgehog obviously has lots of other influences on Crash Bandicoot as well. If you just look at how the Wumpa Fruit does actually replace the rings, and how Crash has 6 coloured gems to collect, very much like the 6 Chaos Emeralds of the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Obviously Crash takes it one step further by actually having main uses for these as well. So you can see similarities here and there, but Crash Bandicoot as a whole is something that even when the original games came out, it was able to completely eclipse almost every other platform that came out on the PlayStation, and that was because of how it chose to render everything. See, Crash Bandicoot takes, and this is something that Naughty Dog does with a lot of its games, uses little hicks and quirks and anything they can to squeeze every little bit of polygon power outside of what the PlayStation was capable of. In this case, the aspect ratio for the original Crash Bandicoot is slightly different. It was now to aspect ratio that Crash there is an aspect ratio that could only be achieved by having certain restraints put on the characters, and in the case of Crash Bandicoot itself, it was a complete lack of textures. If you notice that the original Crash Bandicoot model has no actual textures, he's just flat colour shaded, and all the textures themselves are reserved for boxes and environments and such, all things that mostly don't move. And the boxes, because we have so many of them in screen, would normally take up a lot of processing power, but if you consider the fact they are just simple polygon boxes, it allows absolutely loads of them to be on screen at once with absolutely no hick in how fast the game processes, and the fact there's no slowdown during the game. There's a lot of things that people take for granted, but at the time, the fact that they managed to pull that off, and you had other games really struggling to just even look the part when it came to that early PlayStation era, you can see just what makes Crash Bandicoot so special. On the flip side of that as well, the NSane Trilogy version of Crash Bandicoot is almost entirely artistically wonderful in its own way as well. Crash Bandicoot NSane Trilogy has cutscenes that are better than your average animated TV show. They're almost a movie level quality, and that's because of the attention they've paid to it. They've got original voice actors back who have had at least some involvement with the Crash Bandicoot series as a whole in the past, but the animations themselves as well, they've given character to everything, and while this doesn't always remain true, there are certain features in the animation as well that really show off. They've just tried to make everything a lot more cinematic than it used to be, which is something that obviously is important, because just like with Crash Bandicoot and how levels designs were made so that the processing power of the PlayStation could be accounted for, when it's come to the PlayStation 4, they've used that same philosophy because levels are based on the same telemetry data, and so the same rendering techniques can be applied. They can pack as much detail as physically possible into a small space of area, because Crash Bandicoot 1, as you've probably noticed by this point, is extremely compressed in terms of level data and how everything works. You don't get to see that far in the distance most of the time, and when you've got a lot of level stuff happening, you're generally in a compressed space where you can't see much going forward, because they want to have all that detail there around you, and that's how they achieved it in the PlayStation. That's why the same kind of programming when applied to the PS4 means you can have so much more happening in a small space of area. But of course, when you do get some of those big wide open areas as well, unlike the original, you have big open environments that look absolutely amazing, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's just another evolution of that art, and if anything, the artistic evolution of Crash Bandicoot is something that I think Vicarious Visions nailed it completely from start to finish when it comes to just making it look absolutely amazing. And I don't think anyone's going to argue that there's not really many areas where they kind of drop the ball in that. It looks amazing, and just showing the difference between what could be achieved back then and what can be achieved now. Outside of the more obvious changes as well to the art and world of Crash Bandicoot, you do have the animation as well. Now, animation in Crash Bandicoot has always been something that's brought the character alive, and especially fans of the latter games in this series as well, like the idle animations and things Crash does in general, just help make the character the fun character that he is. Crash has incredible animations for almost everything, where it comes from just being idle to all the different ways that Crash can die in the game to all the other bits and pieces that just make Crash 1 and the Crash trilogy as a whole such an enjoyable experience, even when dying, because everything is so fun. And Vicarious Visions did manage to honour and recreate almost everything in the game, and when it comes to it, it's the animation that really brings it alive. Obviously there's only so much they could do in the original Crash, and yet they still managed to bring everything alive. The running animations always seemed a little stilted, and that's even more so now that we've seen what Crash 2 and 3 could do when it came to how far Naughty Dog could push the animations going forward. And Vicarious Visions almost retroactively bring Crash alive in a number of ways as well, from that lovely little opening to just the whole audio and personality of everything that drives Crash as well. And on top of that too, we also just have the general running and jumping animations that look so much smoother than they used to, and it really helps with those jumping arcs and just making them feel correct, and the way that the arms always loop around following the tumbles of the body as Crash jumps, and his animations. And this is taken one step further as well with Coco, who's obviously completely original with the exception of the few times you could play her doing things in Crash 3. She's now a fully playable character in almost every way possible, with the exception of certain boss levels and levels only Crash can do. She comes back in a time machine and you can recruit her after the first boss of Crash 1, and from that point on you're free to select either one of the characters at any point, and she controls almost the same as Crash. It's slightly harder to detect her hitbox because of her crazy hair compared to Crash, but she's well, makes for a nice little diversity to the game. She's a much lighter character in tone, and that can help her stand out a little bit more in some of the darker levels, but there's no real gameplay difference to the two, although sometimes it can feel like it just because of the slightly different dimensions of the characters themselves, but it's certainly a nice little extra to add on top. But I think I call out animations here because unlike there just being a remaster of Crash 1 being done here, Naughty Dog also did a slight remaster, or at least a recreation of Crash Bandicoot 1 in Uncharted 4, and that's ironic because I felt like playing that Crash in that, both his jumping and his animations in general were very much stilted, and while it controlled the same, it didn't look and feel the same. And I think that's something that's worth pointing out because Vicarious did actually manage to nail that, and if you look at that little gameplay segment in Uncharted 4, it just doesn't look right, and obviously that's one of those key things that I do wonder what would happen had Naughty Dog gone and recreated this from general. They made that, but it's just a little mini game, and so you're not expecting perfection, but nevertheless, what I wonder would have happened had Naughty Dog decided they were going to undertake this kind of job for a remaster, and I'd be interested to see what the new guns at Naughty Dog, given that the new generation of the Naughty Dog game designers there aren't actually the old guard, and Andy Gavin and everyone else has very much left now, and it's the new guard who've kind of, you know, forwarded this gameplay and artistic world before gameplay, even though gameplay is king. It's that kind of drives everything forward, and I wonder what they'd be like at an old style retro game, and if they did this, or maybe Jak and Daxter someday, how it would look. It's just worth thinking about, and actually made me somewhat thankful that Vicarious Visions got the job, given that they've actually done Crash Bandicoot games before. They've done the Game Boy Advance Crash Bandicoot XS, which was a faithful recreation of Crash Bandicoot on a much smaller scale, and gave me faith that they could do a good gameplay experience, even though if I was worried at the time about the animation, but that's come through leaps and bounds ahead of what I expected as well. But I suppose really that's not really what we want to discuss here. You see, Crash Bandicoot itself, and one of the many things that people have brought up about the NSane trilogy is that the games are hard, and Crash Bandicoot 1 is harder still, and this is actually by design, but I can see the reasonings behind it. But let's talk about Crash 1 first. You see, Crash Bandicoot 1 is the quintessential platformer. Crash Bandicoot has a set of skills. You can run forwards, backwards, left, right, you can jump, and you can spin attack, and that is it. That is the core moveset you get for the first Crash Bandicoot game, and while there are little extras on top of that, like invincibility if you collect 3 masks, and the ability to jump higher if you're bouncing on enemies, and small things in the environment that will modify those basic sets of skills, that is what you're stuck with for the entire game. Everything is based around using those skills, and levels and secrets and things are very much about how you look at the environment and what you find in that, and it's not something that Crash's skills are going to help you discover, only that they're going to help you get to if all the work is done with you as the player finding and looking for these clues in the environment. And that's kind of where the problem lies, in that everything is made around that, and so it gets harder, but Crash himself has a very defined set of physics, and in the first Crash Bandicoot game it's not hard to see why. Obviously you have to be consistent, you have to get those physics down, but Crash Bandicoot in the PlayStation era had a fixed set of momentum that means, well, you can't really do tiny jumps without Crash being carried forward just a little bit. That makes the tiniest jumps extremely hard to line up, and jumping box to box to box can be extremely hard, especially when you're going forward into the depth of the environment and not going from left to right like your traditional 2D platformer. But it's something that can be accounted for, and something that, in the vein of Crash 1, makes perfect sense really, that there is no walking, you're going from nothing to running, and then you can get the biggest jump distance possible, and you've got that momentum to carry you on. Now this is one of the biggest changes they've made for the Crash Bandicoot NSane trilogy, because it is a trilogy of games. They've chosen to make the physics throughout all 3 games line up and be the same, so you get the same experience with all 3 games. That's fine in theory, but the difference between what Crash Bandicoot 1 did and what Crash Bandicoot 3 did is a whole world of differences. Crash Bandicoot 3 obviously had a completely different physics system and jumping arc, and you've probably noticed this as well if you're keen-eyed, that in Crash Bandicoot 1 jumps aren't necessarily higher, but they have a different arc to them, more of an ellipse that has an actual slower step to it, while as Crash Bandicoot in the remaster has an arc that goes up really fast and comes down just as quick, and this is coupled with something in the physics hit detection that I'll talk about in a second. But it means that as a whole, the jumping process in Crash Bandicoot, the remaster, is actually a lot harder to line up, which is one of the key problems that everyone seems to be having with the game, because it's been based on Crash 3's physics, and also they have removed that extra momentum that makes it carried on, which means that in the remaster it's actually a lot easier to line up your jump to jump to jump when it comes to bouncing on one box at a time for those bonus stages. And that part of the control section, I actually agree, makes the game easier. However, once again, on the flip side, it's coupled with hit detection, and obviously the PlayStation era was very much limited to boxes and polygons. No one really used capsules back then. There were boxes, and Crash Bandicoot's hitbox was a box, which meant boxes lining on boxes was either you hit it or you missed, and in most cases the hitbox was slightly bigger than it looked like it was going to be. In Crash Bandicoot the remaster, we have capsules, and if anyone's familiar with capsules, it's basically two spheres with the distance in between them drawn in, which means that it's actually possible to land on the very edge of an object and slide off, or keep jumping on the edge of an object and slowly find yourself slowly sliding down as you jump. This means that Crash Bandicoot, when it comes to the more phonetical parts of the NSane trilogy, doesn't give you much time to just sit back and relax once you've made a jump, even if you're at a point where you're on something really simple or you're on a bouncing enemy, and I'll give you some examples of this very soon. You don't just get the chance, unless you're lined up perfectly, to keep jumping until you're ready to take the next jump. It's very much pushing you forward, which is something that Crash Bandicoot the original doesn't do, but the philosophy of the remaster seems very much based around making what is a slow, precise game actually move faster, and it's again something that I don't think is necessarily inspired by Sonic the Hedgehog games going forward, but it's something that the evolution of Sonic took going forward, and something that Crash did as well. By the time we got from Crash Bandicoot 1 to Crash Bandicoot 3, Crash had a faster movement state, he had faster jumps, he had an ability to run added to him, or at least dash on top of your run, and time trials were added in the last game as well. It was all about making the game faster and making you go through that game faster, and Crash Bandicoot the first doesn't have that. It's not made like that, it's not designed like that. Vicarious Visions for the NSane trilogy have added time trials to every single Crash Bandicoot level, which in my thoughts doesn't really gel. You shouldn't be trying to get through these levels fast, because some of them are just not made that way. It can make an insane experience even more so, because of it's pushing you to do things that the game itself wasn't designed for. Now, that's not to say you can't challenge yourself and do these things, and obviously there's no reason to for the actual main plot of the game. They've made the main bulk of the game slightly easier as well, with some of the behind the scenes changes they've made as well. Crash Bandicoot's original save system was fairly non-existent. You could only save when you either finished the level, got a gem, or you hit a bonus stage in the game, and that were the only three ways you could save, which meant that if you wanted to get that lovely 101% completion that the original Crash had, you had to do everything. You couldn't use a cheat code to unlock everything, because there'd just be no way to save at that point. The only way to get the perfect run in Crash Bandicoot is to do it perfectly. And there's a few rules within that as well, because gem collection in the original Crash Bandicoot, which is something you get from a level if you destroyed all the boxes, wasn't easy. You couldn't do it without dying, and this is something they've actually changed for Crash Bandicoot in the NSane Trilogy version. It's not always the case, but gems, obviously you can die, and you still get a running total of how many boxes you collected at the end of the level, despite in Crash Bandicoot 1 this being obviously only if you'd finished the level without dying did you get that hallowed screen of how many boxes you missed. On the flip side of that as well, bonus stages have been made slightly easier by allowing you to have a second go at them. In one of the small tweaks they've actually made to the levels, aside from extra boxes here and there and small bits and pieces that either make the game easier or make up for one of the new things they've added to the trilogy, you've actually got bonus platforms now, as opposed to just collecting 3 bonus tokens in the original Crash game and then being transported to a level where you get one and only one try at it. Now you have the option, if you fail, to just keep trying and trying again until you do it, and with some of the more harder bonus stages as well, really requiring a kind of trial and error and learning the route kind of way, as well as perhaps needing 10 or 20 tries to even get it right your first time. It's very much welcome that they've done these things, and ultimately I think this additional extra to make the game easier is offset by the time trials, and I do wonder if that was what they were going for. You see, while I don't like the idea of time trials, having an extra bonus of some sort for a perfect run for each level wouldn't have been a bad thing, seeing that's what the original Crash Bandicoot wanted, but it locks so many people out of actually getting to the end of the game. Vicarious Visions have kept the colour gems along the same philosophy though, that you do have to finish the levels of those without dying to actually get them, and given that 5 out of the 6 coloured gems are all within the final 10 levels of the game anyway, you really still have to do the very hardest of the game in order to actually see the proper ending. So it's not changing too much, it only makes the easier gems just that little easier to get. If anything, it reduces the amount of time you've got to play. But of course there are a few things in the hard levels as well with the level artistry that did make things a little bit harder than they used to be in the Crash Bandicoot version 2. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but while they've done an absolutely flawless recreation of the levels based on the telemetry data, which is the some of the blueprints of what the levels were, the original 3D models themselves have been built up with the originals in mind and used as complete reference to make sure that the game's one-for-one recreation is just that. Some of the artists and the texture work has made stuff a lot harder to identify. Platforms that were easily telegraphed as platforms that were different in some way in the original Crash have been blended with the environment in the latter levels of Crash 1 as well, which makes everything harder. Obviously, this is something done to really catch off older players, because newer players obviously won't be expecting these things to move anyway and will learn by error, but they're little bits here and there to catch off the more experienced players of Crash, people who might have even gone back to play the original game before the new one came out, or just people who think they have a good memory of those original games and are slowly finding out things just aren't quite what they expected them to be. Getting back to my point earlier, the Vicarious Visions save data system is very much different to that original Crash Bandicoot, and again it's consistent across all 3 games. Just like today's technology, we have an autosave system as well that makes everything a lot easier, as well as HUDs on top of them. As well as having HUDs on top of the menus on the world map as well that show you everything you've done, and just making everything a lot more clearer to what's in every level. It also looks pretty stunning as well, which is by no means a bad thing. But just the addition of save slots as well is something else that means there's less pressure to do everything perfectly, and it's just a nice little extra that kind of brings Crash 1 in line with the original games in many ways, which again, no bad thing, and quite a nice thing that Vicarious have done. It really is, I think, the overall philosophy of what this remaster does that makes the original Crash hard, and therefore I can see why fans have been in so much contention about. And see, prior to this coming out, Vicarious Visions stated that you might have a harder experience going through Crash 1, or it would be somewhat different because they've based the physics of the game on Crash 3. In itself, that's fine. Unity between 3 games is fine, and the fact that they are pushing that you might want to start with 2 and 3 as opposed to starting with 1 is something that I can't quite get behind as a statement. Yes, Crash 1 is hard, but it's the original philosophy, and by no means it's the best game in the series, but I think if you're going to make a pure remaster experience, at least for the fans, give the option of the Crash 1 physics. Make it a toggle between them. If people want to uniformly use Crash 3's physics, then let them go for it. But because the remaster implements the controls and the movement of Crash 3, it means if you're using the analog stick you can walk, and by that same reason that if you need to quickly accelerate from 0 to 1, using the analog stick to do it isn't going to give you the maximum speed straight away. And the last levels of Crash 3, especially ones like the High Road, which are absolutely insane to go through because they're just jumping from one finesse jump to another on the very smallest of platforms, it can really be an almost impossible experience to use the analog for. This is a game made for the D-pad, and you should only use that. Again, because of the jumping arc from Crash 3 as well, it's possible to get the exact same jumping distance from Crash 1, but only if you're at the maximum speed, which means you can't jump on the spot and make that distance because you do not have the momentum to carry you forward. Crash 1 wasn't as worrisome when it comes to the momentum because it seemed to add some as part of the jump. Crash 3 doesn't do this, and so if you don't have a run up before your jump, you will find that many of the jumps you just won't make, and this is coupled with the physics hitbox detection that I mentioned earlier, means that a lot of times you're going to find yourself looking like you're about to land on the ledge, only for you to land on it and then slip off the edge. One of the most infuriating features of this game, and something that just by trying to honour those original physics would have been at least a nice step way around, because at least you could say that way, yes, this was as hard as it was in the original, even though Vicarious Visions' actual version of that mid-air jump and physics was actually refined better. I think the fact that it's so finicky to actually get the maximum jump that you can't 100% always guarantee you're going to get it. Makes it a lot harder, and it means that just very much like the Uncharted games, you're going to have to run to the point where you feel like you're almost running in mid-air before you make that jump if you want to almost guarantee you're going to do it. And this is made even harder as well by the camera, which is something that both Crashes share, because the camera placement behind the character is fairly perfect, and I'm surprised they didn't change this. But when it comes to running behind, when it comes to the camera behind Crash as he runs forward and you're trying to make those jumps, it can be extremely hard to do. And thankfully they have chosen to make Crash's shadow visible even when there's absolutely nothing for it to be projected onto, so you can line up those jumps a little bit easier, which makes stuff like the high roads a lot easier. But when you get to levels which are like the lab right at the end of the game, it makes no difference because you can't really see that shadow half the time anyway, and given there's a level as well that's almost in complete darkness, it's not always a guaranteed thing. But it's again something that is it's something that's kind of a balancing act, and ultimately I feel like there was a balance between Vicarious Vision systems and the original Crash system that they could have got, but ultimately haven't managed to achieve. But the lack of a choice for either one perhaps is the biggest flaw in the remaster overall, and something that I think fans will be debating for a long time. And given the popularity and the general overall favoured reception to the remaster, they've also released one level as a bonus from the original Crash that was actually cut, and that's Stormy Ascent. And I kid you not, this level is absolutely insane. And while I do think Crash 1 was hard, the jumps made on this are something that I feel like were only designed to be made with the original physics of Crash 1. It's something that the NSane Trilogy version, while it's nice that they've included, is something that is so ridiculously annoying to get to, and I do believe I probably went through about 50 to 60 lives in my first attempt to get through that level. Ultimately, I don't think it matters too much because it is a bonus, but it just kind of a level as precise as this that was made to be the quintessential Crash 1 experience by Naughty Dog back in the day, that was so hard that only the most perfected of players could do it, really is even harder now because of that, because of this brand new physics system that Vicarious have brought in. Shows that the remaster controls and the physics and everything aren't quite up to scratch of what they should have been because of how hard it makes this one level. Now you may or may not agree with me on this, and that's fair enough, but you can ultimately see what they were going for here when they made this, and I think what they've set out and achieved is something that uniformly is better for those of you who've never played Crash before. And ultimately I do agree that if you want a fantastic Crash experience, you don't need to play the first game. And if anything, there's so many things from the first game that were dropped because it didn't work well going forward with the trilogy. If you account for sloping paths when going from forward to backwards, these are something that was almost completely removed from Crash 2 going forward because of how hard it can make it to judge jumps and diagonal slopes and jumps and things. These are all things kind of got refined with Crash 2 and were made easier, and obviously their knowledge of the PlayStation allowed them to have slightly better rendering techniques and make those levels a little bit open. Crash 1 is a game that sticks you either in a corner or in a tunnel in a very condensed environment a lot of the time, or very simple open 2D landscapes, which again, no bad thing, but it's based around those two things because that was what they'd managed to master at that point on the PlayStation, and master it they did, given no doubts on that. But it is nevertheless an extremely hard game that is very much full of as many fails when it comes to design and implementation, and it does succeed, but because it looks the part, and given the time of when it came out, it was very much leaps and bounds ahead. It was almost the Mario 64 of the PlayStation era, and that's no bad thing in any way at all. But overall, it was an incredibly fun experience, and playing through both of them, both versions of this back to back, has actually taught me a lot about general game design and some of the tricks that Naughty Dog would use to create their games back then, and how they still use those tricks now, even when Sony haven't necessarily been in the loop about such things. The original version of Jak and Daxter actually piggybacked onto the PlayStation 1 system that was included in the PlayStation 2 as a way of getting extra memory out of the system and processing power, which not many people or companies I imagine would have thought to have done, mostly because I don't think they're technically allowed to, but it's just a way that they've always pushed everything they've got to get the most possible artistic vision out of the game. And when it came to it, Naughty Dog have always been amazing game artists, and gameplay has always taken not a back seat, but more and more so it's becoming more cinematic and less gameplay that's refined, but still very much fun, and you can't fault that, as it's the way the game industry has kind of gone. And other game franchises and indie games are very much picking up the slack in those areas now anyway. It's more open than it was before. But Crash Bandicoot, the NSane trilogy, is almost a required purchase. You have to play it, you have to try it, but I don't necessarily know if I say you have to play through all of Crash 1. It's certainly a challenge, and it's certainly something that's going to have you frustrated to the point where you'll be throwing the controllers sometimes. If anyone was following me on Twitter, they've seen my reactions to some of the levels, but nevertheless, it's a fun experience worth trying, and I think the original Crash games are also worth giving a shot as well, especially Crash 1, so you can really learn for yourself the differences, and you can feel the differences in the controls of what they've done here. Ultimately, I do prefer the remaster. It looks prettier, and for all the extra physics problems that I've had, I do think the refinements they made to the jumping based on Crash 3's version of jumping were better, because at that point Naughty Dog had worked out how to make them better, and by Crash 3 they kind of perfected that. So you have the perfection of, you know, the best Crash has ever been from the Naughty Dog era in Crash 1. It's just that you can't always guarantee, because of how they've implemented controls in Crash 1 and the remaster, you're going to get that perfect jumping arc you need, or that maximum distance, and the maximum distance will be what takes you most of the time. Nevertheless, unless they patch it or they add some sort of way to change it in the future, I think it's bearable, and I think you can work through it with time and patience, and that's how you're supposed to play Crash 1, with time and patience, and judging every jump from one to the next. None of the time trial rubbish on top, because the game wasn't designed for it. It's there, great, if you want to play it, go for it, knock yourself out. But you'll see and you'll learn that that game was just not made with that kind of stuff in mind. It's slow, it's precision, and ultimately it's enjoyable. The remaster is faster. Not a bad thing, just not the original intention, and I think that's where perhaps the remaster as a flaw shines through its most. And also, and its greatest in some ways as well, because it lets you appreciate the care that went into remaking it and what they tried to change to make it easier. Either way, I hope you love the Crash Bandicoot games going forward, because it looks like we'll probably get a new one coming soon in some form or another. And ultimately, thanks for checking out this video on Crash Bandicoot, and I hope you check out some of the others as well. I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe or leave a comment. Just tell me what you think. Tell me what you think of the Crash Bandicoot games in general, because I've only actually played the original 4 myself up to Wrath of Cortex, and I've not played anything else afterwards. I'm very much in that old PlayStation era and very early PS2 era of Crash games. So yeah, what do you think about it? What would you like me to cover in the future for analysis like this? This is a slightly shorter one, but I didn't see the point in going absolutely overboard for this one, as well there's not as much of a need to, unlike some of the other bigger RPGs. And so, well, thank you just for watching, and yeah, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, my artwork as well, which I do game artwork and bits and pieces of as well. You can also find in the links, so check me out. Thanks for watching, and yeah, like, share, subscribe, and see ya.